The folder sat at the edge of the table. My name was printed in blue across the cover, sharp enough to sting. I set my hand over it, fingers sticky from cement dust. The smell of concrete still clung to my skin. My name is David. I was 52 years old, a construction foreman in Houston. This house wasn't paper. It was years of sweat, steel, and poured walls. No one at the table looked up. Mark's steps came loud down the hallway. The click of his lighter announced him before his face did. He leaned against the frame, a smirk rehearsed like a salesman's pitch. My mother Carol slid her glass closer to the middle, eyes down. My father Peter rubbed his palm against his pants, staring into the carpet. My wife Tracy gripped her purse strap, covering the phone as the screen lit. Not one of them asked about my day. Not one word of welcome. The silence was rehearsed. Mark didn't wait for permission. He sat across from me. He said, "You know it would be easier if the house was under my name." I replied, "It is my house. I built it." He said, "You think short term?" "I think family." Carol adjusted her napkin without lifting her head. Peter checked his watch by the door. Tracy tightened her grip again. The folder lay between us, dividing line in plain view. Sweat ran down my back, shirt sticking. They wanted me nervous. They wanted me to fold. I said it 3 times. I built this house. I fixed its roof. I poured its walls. No one answered. The fan above rattled once, louder than my words. My fist closed over the folder, knuckles turning white. In 3 days, one of them would beg. Mr. Howard across the street pretended not to watch when Mark stepped outside to smoke. His eyes lingered longer than usual. Even neighbors could see the cracks spreading inside my walls. That night I sat in the kitchen. The fridge hummed. A crumpled Home Depot receipt lay stuck to the counter, damp with sweat. I turned it in my fingers. Mark came in without knocking, gravel dust falling from his boots. He said, "David, you can't drag this forever." I replied, "I can drag it as long as I want." He said, "You've got 72 hours. After that, we do it without you." My name in his mouth was a knife. Carol slid the vase 2 inches. Peter's eyes fixed on the dark window. Tracy covered her phone quick, hand shaking just enough. Keys lay on the counter. Not mine. Not his. A spare set left on purpose. The steel teeth caught the light. They wanted me rattled. Sweat rolled down my spine. Sunday, 6:45 a.m., the clock would start. In 3 days, one of them would beg. I walked the hallway. A board creaked under my step. The air carried tobacco smoke, though no one stood there. As shadows shifted where there was no one. Morning came heavy. I stopped at 7-Eleven for coffee. The cardboard cup went empty fast. I crushed it in my hand, the seam splitting. My mind stayed locked on the table, vase, napkin, keys. The empty cup was a symbol now. Memory hit hard. Years back, my kids brought me water while I laid foundation. Their laughter carried as I climbed into the Ford, covered in dust. Now their absence was twisted into a weapon against me. Evening returned. Mark pushed through the door after a single knock, lighter clicking. He sat closer this time. He said, "We can split the house clean?" I replied, "Paper doesn't decide who owns a roof." He said, "The court does." Carol moved her glass again. Peter rubbed his palms slower. Tracy turned away. The folder sat untouched. The metal teeth of the keys caught the lamp light. In 3 days, one of them would beg. My hand pressed down on the folder. The paper chilled my skin. The keys bit into my palm, sharp and ready. The keys hit the table hard enough to rattle the salt shaker. Sunday, 6:45 a.m. 72 hours. That's all I had before the next move. My brother stood in the kitchen doorway like he owned it. He didn't knock. He never did. He said, "David, this can go the easy way." I replied, "Easy for you, never for me." He smiled without warmth. Carol shifted a vase 2 inches left. Peter rubbed his palm against his thigh and looked away. Tracy gripped the strap of her bag. None of them spoke my name. Only Mark did. He said, "David, you're dragging this out?" The sound of my name from his mouth turned the air sour. I caught my reflection in the microwave glass. Cement dust still lined my knuckles from the job site. My hands had built that house. They weren't clean now, and they would never be. The fan rattled above us. No one fixed it. The sound scraped my nerves raw. In 3 days, one of them would beg. I took my Ford keys back off the table. The teeth left scratches in the wood. Mark noticed, and he smirked. The smirk was worse than words. I walked outside. The morning air carried diesel and damp grass. A neighbor across the street, Mrs. Walker, bent to pick up her newspaper. She froze halfway and stared. She had seen too much. I lifted a hand, not a wave, just to show her I knew she was watching. She disappeared inside without a word. The gravel crunched under my boots. I counted steps to the truck. 14 exactly. Same as always. Routines kept me steady. My chest tightened anyway. The air felt heavier than cement bags stacked in summer. I opened the Ford door. The seatbelt was twisted again. Tracy always left it that way. I fixed it slow, with both hands, as if straight straps could fix more than fabric. At the 7-Eleven, the line was short. The clerk, young, chewing gum, glanced at me too long. My cup slipped when he pushed it across the counter. Coffee spilled on my hand. It burned. I didn't flinch. He mumbled sorry. I left the empty 7-Eleven cup on the hood outside. The wind knocked it over. It rolled until it hit my boot. That cup stayed in my head like a nail. In 72 hours. In 72 hours. In 72 hours. Flashback hit me on the drive home. Emily at 12, sitting on the tailgate, handing me bottled water after a long day. She laughed when I poured some on my head to cut the heat. Her laughter had weight. It meant something solid. The cab smelled like wet concrete back then. Now it smelled like betrayal. At home, the door was unlocked. Tracy was already inside, phone in hand. She said, "You could meet them halfway." I replied, "Halfway to where?" She said, "To peace." Her screen lit up. She covered it with her palm. I heard a step upstairs, too heavy for her. The sound stopped fast, like someone holding breath. The smell of cheap cologne lingered. Not mine. Not hers. In 3 days, one of them would beg. Mark sat in my chair before I even entered the room. He tapped his lighter against his thigh. Tap. 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 He said, "Time's against you, David." I replied, "Time works both ways." Peter stepped back toward the window. He didn't look at me. Carol adjusted a napkin already straight. She didn't look at me. The silence pressed harder than the words. False ending came then. I set my keys on the table like surrender. For a moment, Mark leaned forward, certain he had won. He reached for the folder. My hand closed back on the keys before his fingers touched paper. His smirk cracked. The fridge hummed. The bulb above flickered once, then steadied. The clock read Sunday 6:45 a.m. 72 hours. Not one less. Not one more. Steps sounded in the hallway. Slow, deliberate. Not mine. Not theirs. They thought it was over. They were wrong. The steps kept coming. The photo lay flat on the county clerk's desk. A faded picture of me in younger years, holding a hammer, Emily beside me with a level too big for her hands. She had been 10, maybe 11, her sneakers coated with dust from the job site. The clerk didn't look at the picture, only at the papers Mark had filed. The smell of toner hung in the office, mixed with the faint odor of burned coffee. The stamp sat ready, the handle shiny from use. I kept my hands steady on the counter. The edge of the photo pressed into my palm. Mark leaned closer. He said, "David, it's easier if you stop fighting." I replied, "You've said that before." He said, "This time you'll listen?" The clerk cleared his throat. A witness, silent but present. His eyes moved between us, then back to the stack of documents. In 3 days, one of them would beg. I didn't say which. The chair under me squeaked when I shifted. Cold air drifted from the vent above, carrying the smell of paper and ink. For a moment I let silence do the talking. Then I slid the photo back toward myself. At home later that night, I stood by the window. The empty coffee cup from 7-Eleven sat on the sill, the logo peeling. A neighbor, Mr. Alvarez, trimmed his hedge across the street. He paused when he saw me, waved once, and turned back to his clippers. He had watched Mark's truck outside my driveway the night before. Witnesses were everywhere. I stepped onto the porch. My boots pressed against the boards, dry leaves crunching below. Mr. Alvarez said, "Long night yesterday?" I replied, "Too long." He said, "Your brother's around a lot lately?" I replied, "He doesn't know when to leave." Alvarez nodded, eyes steady. His silence said more than words. In 72 hours. In 72 hours. In 72 hours. The next morning, I drove to the bank. The smell of diesel clung to my jacket from the job site. My crew had muttered when I left early. One of them said, "Boss looks worn." Another said, "Not our problem." The men went back to shovels, their talk trailing with the sound of machinery. The air there always carried grit and fuel. Inside the bank, the fluorescent lights hummed. I handed over a check, the paper damp from my grip. The teller glanced at the name, Mark's name, already added as if he owned what wasn't his. For a second, I almost signed. My pen hovered above the line. A false ending. I let it hang there, my hand still, the ink not touching. Then I pushed the paper back. The teller's eyebrow lifted. She said, "Do you want me to process this?" I replied, "Not yet." The sound of the printer started up beside her, spitting out another customer's receipt. The smell of toner grew stronger. A page jammed, wrinkled in the machine. The clerk tugged it free with a sharp rip. That sound carried more weight than my words. Flashback. Emily again on the site, holding a bucket of water, her hair stuck to her forehead. She had smiled when I told her the walls would stand longer than both of us. She had balanced the level with careful hands, proud of the bubbles settling between lines. Now that photo was the only proof left that she had once been there beside me. Mark cornered me by the courthouse steps 2 days later. He said, "Everyone sees you folding, David." I replied, "They see what I allow them to." He said, "You're 52? You don't have the fight left." I didn't answer at once. The courthouse doors opened, a bailiff walking out, his boots clicking on stone. Another witness. I let Mark think he had me. Silence held, then I spoke. I replied, "The fight's still mine." The courthouse clock struck 9:30. Wednesday, 9:30 p.m. would come soon enough. In 3 days, one of them would beg. The air smelled faintly of smoke as I walked back to my truck. A cigarette but lay near the step, still warm. Someone else had been close, watching. I didn't pick it up. Back home, Tracy sat at the table, her phone face down. She said, "You're late?" I replied, "I had things to check." She said, "With Mark?" I replied, "With myself?" Her eyes fell to the empty cup still on the sill. She didn't touch it. Neither did I. The fridge hummed once, then went silent. The sound of the stamp still echoed in my head. The handle, the weight, the finality it promised. The stamp waited. The receipts covered half the kitchen table. Thin sheets with black numbers, overdue marks in red ink, folded corners showing how often they had been handled. Tracy stood at the counter, her hand over her phone. Carol slid a vase toward the center. Peter rubbed his palms slowly. The faucet dripped in irregular rhythm, louder than it should have been. Mark tapped his lighter against the table edge. He said, "The math doesn't lie, David." I replied, "Math can be twisted." He said, "Not when the numbers all point the same way." I pressed my thumb on one receipt, felt the paper bend. In 72 hours, one of them would beg. The clock above the stove ticked, each second sharper than the last. At the site, the generator coughed diesel into the morning air. Men moved wheelbarrows through dust, steel clanging against steel. A shovel cut gravel, voices dropped when I passed. I caught words half heard. Boss slipping. Won't last. The grit of cement stuck to my boots, sweat dampened the collar of my shirt. At 52, I carried more years than they saw. A flashback caught me mid-step. Emily, 10 years old, walked toward me with a gallon of water. Her arms struggled with the weight, but she set it down next to my tools. She said, "You missed a line, Dad?" I replied, "Show me." She held the level, the bubble steady, her smile sharper than any correction. That memory stayed longer than any building I raised. The foreman's office smelled of oil and dry paper. My phone buzzed again. Mark's text, "Meet at the bank, 2 o'clock." The bank lobby was cold. The hum of the copier filled the room. Toner smell hung in the air. I handed receipts to a clerk in a blue shirt. He said, "These accounts are flagged." I replied, "Just make the copies." He said, "You'll need a signature, sir." The machine spat pages, one jamming halfway. The clerk pulled it free, the edge torn, the numbers still legible. He set a heavy stamp on the corner. The thud echoed too loud. I carried the stack back in silence. In 3 days, the sound of that stamp would matter more. Outside the house, Mr. Alvarez leaned on his fence. He said, "Hard week, David?" I replied, "Something like that." He said, "People talk. Whole street knows something's boiling." He looked at my porch, where the empty 7-Eleven cup still sat, stuck to the sill by dried soda. He didn't ask. He just nodded once, his eyes too steady. Evening carried more weight inside the house. Tracy covered her phone when I walked in. She said, "He called again." I replied, "He always does." She said, "Maybe you should take the offer." I replied, "Maybe I already thought about it." Silence stayed long enough to feel like a decision. I pulled a pen from my pocket, laid it flat on the table. Mark arrived, his smirk in place. He said, "Ready to end this?" I replied, "Maybe." He said, "Just sign, and you'll breathe again." I let my hand hover over the line, the pen close enough to touch. The room leaned towards stillness. False ending. My hand pulled back. His smirk slipped for half a second. Carol adjusted the vase again. Peter looked away toward the window. Tracy's grip tightened on her strap. The fridge clicked once and settled. In 72 hours, they thought I would fold. In 72 hours, one of them would beg. Mark pushed the receipts forward. He said, "Sign it." The paper slid across the wood, stopping with a flat sound that stayed. The statement from Wells Fargo lay flat on the kitchen table, the corners curling from my thumb pressing too long against the paper. The numbers told their own story, one I already knew, but they wanted me to read it out loud with my signature. In 3 days, one of them would beg. The clock read Wednesday 9:30 p.m., and the silence in the room had a weight I couldn't push away. My boots were still on, dust from the yard trailing across the tile, and Tracy stood near the counter gripping her bag strapped too tight. Mark arrived late, flipping his key fob against his palm like he owned the place already. He placed another stack of statements on the table, receipts folded inside, and stared at me until I lifted my eyes. Carol adjusted the napkin holder without reason, pushing it half an inch. Peter rubbed his palm, the sound of skin dragging on skin louder than it should have been. He said, "David, it's just numbers, it's nothing personal." I replied, "Nothing about this is personal?" He smirked. The habit caught me. I rolled the house key in my fingers, the small weight grounding me. I had done it since I was 20, waiting for foreman to hand me the next assignment, waiting for a clerk to stamp my permit at county records, waiting for Tracy to decide if dinner was worth starting. The key spun between my fingers now. Mark's smile thinned when he noticed. The next morning I stopped at the Wells Fargo branch off Richmond Avenue. The air smelled like toner and plastic card stock, the kind that sticks to your fingers. A clerk with short hair slid the papers back and forth, her nails tapping once against the counter. She said, "Do you want a certified copy?" I replied, "Make it 2, stamp them both." She raised an eyebrow but leaned over the machine, the heavy click echoing through the quiet lobby. In 3 days, one of them would beg. On the way out, I passed a woman balancing her purse and a bag of groceries. She whispered to the clerk as I walked by, her eyes trailing me until the door closed. The glass caught my reflection, and for the first time I saw the lines deeper around my mouth. 52 years old, still carrying receipts that never belonged to me. The door hissed shut behind me. At the job site, the smell of diesel filled the air, men shouting over generators. I heard my name break the noise, low voices, cut short when I walked closer. They stood near the scaffolding, boots heavy with cement dust. One said my name, the other looked away. In 3 days, one of them would beg. I picked up the level leaning against the beam, the same kind Emily once held for me on a summer Saturday, her hands small and clumsy but determined to help. She laughed when the bubble sat dead center. She ran to the cooler, brought me water, the sun catching her hair. That memory stayed louder than the voices behind me. Back home, the neighbor stood on his lawn trimming nothing, just holding the shears like a prop. He said, "Long week, huh?" I replied, "Long enough." His eyes flicked to the envelope under my arm, then back to his hedge. He said, "Folks talk, David?" I nodded once and walked inside. The empty 7-Eleven cup sat on the windowsill where I left it, straw bent and dry. The kitchen smelled faintly of cigarette smoke, though no one had lit one there in years. That night Mark spread the receipts across the table, flattening them with his hand. He said, "Just sign it, brother. No one has to fight." I placed the pen between my fingers, turned it twice, and leaned forward. My hand touched the paper. For a second they thought I had given in. Carol slid the vase closer to the center. Peter stepped back, his heel catching the rug. Then I set the pen down flat and pushed the stack back across the table. I replied, "Not tonight." The silence lasted too long. Tracy covered her phone when the screen lit, her grip white against the strap. Mark tapped his lighter once, the sound sharp. In 72 hours. In 72 hours. They thought it was over. They were wrong. The final sound was the stamp hitting paper at Wells Fargo, still ringing in my head. The letter from John lay on the table, heavy even in its thin white envelope. My name stared back in black print, the words clear, the meaning final. The living room hummed with the low rattle of the fridge, each vibration running through the floorboards into my boots. Sunday, 6:45 a.m. The countdown was burning through the hours. In 3 days, one of them would beg. I didn't sleep that night. The ceiling fan ticked once each revolution, the pause louder than the sound. Tracy turned in bed, the glow of her phone flashing against her hand, and I knew she wasn't watching the time like I was. I stood, paced the hall, and came back to the kitchen. The empty 7-Eleven cup waited on the sill, the straw bent at an angle no one fixed. My hand shook, not from fear, but from the way silence kept building. At dawn, I drove to the site. Diesel hung in the cold air, a film on my skin. The men worked slower than usual, voices low when I walked by. I heard my name, cut short the moment I looked at them. The compressor hissed, then fell silent. I touched the concrete form, its chill running through my glove. Emily once sat near the same slab, her hands holding the level, proud she could help. She said, "It's straight, Dad." I replied, "Always check twice." She smiled, ran for water. The memory stayed in my chest longer than the diesel stench. By noon, John called. His voice was calm, too calm for the weight of his words. He said, "They've filed early?" I replied, "How soon?" He said, "The hearing notice is coming?" I didn't answer. He said, "David, don't let them push you alone." The line crackled. I hung up, the letter still on the table beside me. In 72 hours. In 72 hours. Later that day, I stepped outside, the air damp and cool. The neighbor stood at his fence, a cigarette burning low in his hand. He said, "Heard your brother's been busy downtown." I replied, "People hear too much." He shrugged, flicked ash to the ground, and looked away. His silence was louder than his words. The smoke drifted toward me, the smell clinging. That evening, Carol slid the vase to the center again, her fingers steady but nervous. Peter rubbed his palm, the skin worn thin from years of work. Mark tapped his lighter, then placed another document in front of me. He said, "All you need is a signature." Tracy covered her phone when the screen lit, her thumb pressed against the strap. I touched the pen, let it roll under my palm. For a second, I let them think I would. Then I pushed it away. I replied, "Not tonight." The silence cracked when the paper dropped from the edge of the table. The sound was sharper than their voices. In 3 days, one of them would beg. They thought it was over. They were wrong. The fridge hummed. The bulb flickered. I didn't move. The courthouse smelled of polish and old paper, the kind that stayed in the air long after doors closed. My boots struck against the tiled floor, each step counted. John walked beside me, his briefcase heavy with documents. Emily sat behind us in the gallery, her eyes steady. Sunday, 6:45 a.m. The clock on the wall didn't care who was losing. In 3 days, one of them would beg. The judge entered, robes shifting, voice low but sharp. Mark sat 2 rows ahead, Tracy beside him, Carol and Peter on either side. Mark tapped his lighter against the table edge, the sound sharp enough to break the silence. He said, "David, this is where it ends." I replied, "Not yet." His smile cracked but didn't fade. The clerk handed out papers, her fingers stained with ink. The pen in front of me caught the light, heavier than any tool I held at the sight. John leaned close. He said, "Stay calm." I nodded, though sweat pressed against the collar of my shirt. In 72 hours. In 72 hours. The words kept circling. Mark's lawyer spoke first, voice trained, rehearsed. He said, "My client only asks for fairness. He wants closure, not conflict." Carol adjusted her glasses, Peter looked down, his palm rubbing again. Tracy covered her phone when a message flashed. The judge turned to me. He said, "Do you understand the claim?" I replied, "I do." His eyes narrowed. He said, "And your response?" For a moment, I let the silence stretch. I placed my hand on the pen, turned it once, let the ink tip hover over the page. They leaned forward, thinking I would break. Emily's breath caught behind me. Then I set the pen flat on the table, pushing it away. I replied, "The house was mine before their words, and it would be mine after." The gallery stirred. The clerk looked at me, waiting for a signal. John opened the folder, slid forward photographs, receipts, the stamped records from Wells Fargo. He said, "Exhibits entered." The sound of the paper sliding was louder than Mark's tapping. The judge reviewed them, his brow heavy. For a second, it looked as if his hand would tilt toward Mark. A false ending. Then Emily stood, her voice clear. She said, "I was there. I saw him keep everything running." The courtroom stilled. The judge paused, then nodded once. He said, "Testimony accepted." Mark smirked, but his hand shook when he reached for his lighter. The silence pressed down hard. In 3 days, one of them would beg. The gavel struck wood, the sound final. The judge said, "Judgment in favor of David Holloway, 52, construction foreman, Houston, Texas." The words cut deeper than anything Mark had prepared. Carol slid the vase in her mind, Peter stepped back inside his silence, Tracy turned away. John closed his briefcase with a snap. Emily's eyes stayed on me. The pen lay still on the table, untouched. My hand stayed at my side. The court emptied, the air cooler now. Rain hit the windows, a flyer stuck to the glass. I stared at it until it sagged. Subscribe if you want more stories about real men who don't scream. They act. Coldly. To the end. Would you have stopped there, or gone further?